I've interviewed a lot of moms over the last 3 years, and I've asked many of them the same question. Do you struggle with mom guilt?
I am definitely one of those that is tormented by the mom guilt.
I feel less guilty about it as the years have gone by, I think.
I felt guilty, and then I felt anxious that I was trying to fix it, but I didn't know how. And then I felt more guilty.
Yeah, I'm pretty gentle on myself.
I have lots of guilt, lots and lots.
And then there was this answer.
My husband and I, we are awesome parents. Sometimes I'm like, geez, it's a shame that we're not going to have more kids because we're freaking awesome at it.
This is the How She Moms podcast with Whitney Archibald. I'm a mother of 5 on a mission to help moms connect with your kids, manage your homes, and create your own unique version of motherhood. I curate ideas from different moms so you can pick and choose what works for you and your family. This week, March 4th to be precise, marks the 3rd anniversary of the How She Moms podcast. And to celebrate, I'm so excited to start a series I've been working on almost from the beginning about a topic that may not seem very celebratory, mom guilt. But what makes me so excited about this topic is the great interviews I've collected and how very relatable and liberating they are. Today we're going to talk about what mom guilt is and why we feel it. This will be the more philosophical part of the conversation. I've always thought of you, listeners of the How She Moms podcast, and myself as mom philosophers, people who think about the ideas surrounding motherhood as well as being practitioners. I didn't actually use the term mom philosopher out loud for a long time because it sounded kind of pretentious. But now I embrace it and I apply that title to you too. It just means we're giving motherhood a lot of thought. Then next episode will be the practical side of mom guilt. We'll talk about some tactics we can use to neutralize mom guilt. And then, because the interviews on this topic were just so good, I'm also going to share several of them with you as standalone episodes. But before we jump into today's episode, we're going to talk about one of How She Mom's sponsors, a very appropriate one for the topic of mom guilt, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is therapy that feels like it was designed for busy moms. There are a lot of things that stand in the way of moms taking care of ourselves and getting the therapy we often need. Scheduling an appointment, arranging a babysitter, even finding the time to drive to an office building. With BetterHelp, all those obstacles disappear. It's professional therapy done securely online. BetterHelp will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist. You can start communicating within 48 hours. It's not a crisis line, it's not self-help, it's professional therapy. The service is available for clients worldwide, no matter where you live, so even if you don't have a lot of local resources, you get access to over 20,000 experts. BetterHelp is committed to finding the right therapeutic match for you, and it's easy and free to change therapists if not. You can also log into your account anytime and send a message to your therapist. You'll get a timely and thoughtful response, plus you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions so you don't have to find that babysitter. You can even schedule it during nap time. Plus, BetterHelp is more affordable than traditional offline therapy and financial aid is available. BetterHelp wants you to start living a happier life today. Visit BetterHelp.com, that's BetterHelp, and join the over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. There's a special offer for How She Mom listeners. You can get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/HowSheMoms. As you heard in the intro, one thing that has surprised me as I've interviewed moms about mom guilt is that some moms feel it very intensely, some moderately, and others actually have no idea what I'm talking about. I've even had to explain to some of them what mom guilt is. My grandma, Donna Dayton, for example. After I explained and asked her if she experienced it, she said,
I think we all just did the best we could, get them educated in church.
But unlike my grandma, most of the moms I've talked to feel mom guilt to some degree or another. I've talked to moms all across the mom guilt spectrum for this series so we can learn from each of their perspective. I asked Monica Packer, host of the About Progress podcast and a growth coach, to define mom guilt for me.
For me, it's more of this nagging voice in my brain that is harsh and all or nothing and using a lot of should language. You should be doing this. You should be doing that. Just a critical voice. And I really feel like when I look back on my parenting for, 10 years, I'm still pretty new at this mom gig. I feel like I'm just starting to get the hang of it. Actually, it's more of that just undercurrent of my own criticism of myself that I see as the big problem. Although I could definitely do away with the random person on a sidewalk telling me what to do with my child, And Brené Brown talks about the difference between guilt and shame. But when I think we're really talking about mom guilt, I think we're really discussing mom shame.
Yeah.
And it's how we are shaming ourselves. Like guilt is a whole other conversation. Yes. Like I did the same thing earlier this week. I did not deal well with a frustrated child who was taking something out on me, and I didn't deal well with it because I was already not doing great that day either. And that was a time to, recollect, think about what I could do better and apologize and repair and move forward. But most of the time it's that shaming voice. And it all comes back to me, is just this fear of not being enough, not being a good enough mom, not doing enough for the kids, not teaching them enough, not being there enough. And it's just this hyper awareness of all of our inadequacies, which is for some reason in the driver's seat that I think is driving this mom shame bus, I guess we could call it. And that I think I'm constantly trying to be aware of and work on.
Since Monica mentioned Brene Brown and the difference between guilt and shame, I think it's worth defining that here. In her TED Talk, Listening to Shame, Brene Brown said, "Shame is a focus on self, guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad." So an example of mom guilt would be telling yourself, "Oh, I made a mistake. I should do that better." And mom shame is taking it to the next level. I am a bad mom. Then Brene Brown takes it even farther and says that guilt can actually be a positive thing. In her book, Daring Greatly, she says, "I believe that guilt is adaptive and helpful. It's holding something we've done or failed to do up against our values and feeling psychological discomfort." Chanel Nielsen, a life coach for moms at ChanelNielsenCoaching.com, talked to me about this using the very relevant example of doing work on her computer.
Like sometimes I'm in the zone, I'm in flow on the computer and I'm really like doing what I'm supposed to do. But when I start to deviate and get distracted, that's when I feel the guilt the most, because it's like, wait, I've already been on the computer doing work and now I'm checking Facebook or whatever on the computer. Do I need to be here? And that's when I start to like question myself. And that's really a big trigger for me, is that piece on the computer. But I do sometimes feel it when I'm working, and sometimes when I've been working for a while, even if I know I'm not needed, even if like the family is all settled doing something, I know they're taken care of, they're fine, I still just feel that like separation from my family guilt.
Yeah, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So what is your relationship with that guilt?
Yes. Okay. This is something that I have learned, kind of looked into a lot and studied about, because I think it's so important that we don't always turn it off. I feel like the message that we hear a lot is like, moms shouldn't feel guilt. Well, the actual truth is guilt is a teacher. And so every time I feel that guilt, it's an opportunity to check in for me. So am I feeling guilty right now because my little guy needs my help and he's running around the house and no one's helping him? Is that the case? And if so, can I help him right now? Like, can I do this later? Maybe. Like, it's a choice. It's a chance to check in. Or am I feeling guilty even though everyone's just watching TV and it's like family movie night and I'm missing, like the situation really each time needs to be looked at. But sometimes we're going to feel that guilt because maybe I've been on the computer for 5 hours and the family does need me and I need to stop. And that guilt is a signal that I need to stop. So some of the messaging that I feel like we get, that we shouldn't feel guilt, is actually wrong. We need to learn from our guilt.
Guilt is growth. Shame stunts growth. Anna Zupanzik was one of the moms I interviewed who really doesn't struggle with mom guilt. She feels it, yes, but more in this instructive sense. She's confident that though she's not perfect, she's doing her best, and that really came through, even in a 1-hour interview. In fact, it took her a while to even think of an example of a time when she felt mom guilt. When she did think of it, she gave a good example of how we can use guilt in an instructive way to improve without being hard on ourselves in the process.
I think there's some times where I feel guilty. The first inclination often for me is just to say no. When the kids are asking something, it's like, no, you know? And it's not until hindsight, when you're looking through your day and you're thinking about it, or even just a few moments afterwards, like, well, I just want to challenge myself. You should just say yes. Is it really a big deal if they do what, I don't know, if they, whatever they're asking, is it really a big deal? So sometimes I'm present enough in the moment to realize I've said no when I probably could have just said yes and had an easy win. And so when I don't seize that moment, sometimes at the end of the day, I'm like, I missed it. I missed that moment and I'm sorry. And I will remember to say sorry to the kids. Like I said no, and I should have said yes, or I said, go find something else to do when I should have been there with you. And so in my own heart, if they ask to read a book, it's always yes. That's just something I've committed to. When they ask, Mom, can you read this to me? Yeah, you can. Yeah, I can. Or I will just as soon as I finish up this dinner. I'll be there in a few minutes.
Now that is some healthy guilt. Anna is also the mom from episode 86, How She Celebrates Birthdays, who threw her 3-year-old son a garbage party. You should definitely go back and listen to her tell that story. But unfortunately, it gets more complicated than this. Because especially when there's shame mixed in, let alone anxiety and or depression, guilt isn't always a reliable emotion. It's not always logical.
And sometimes our guilt is so silly. I know I've felt guilty sometimes, like reading a book to one child. How can you feel guilty? Well, because I have 5 kids. I'm not reading a book to the other 4 right now. Like guilt can be a silly emotion sometimes because we can't both go to work and provide for our family and be with our kids. If that's your scenario, if that's what you need to do. Sometimes we just need to look it in the face, and then it gets pretty flimsy and it kind of dissolves if we really look at it head on.
I also like Renee Rena's take on this.
I feel like a lot of the time, like general guilt is based in something that is rational. Whereas mom guilt, for the most part, in my experience, it's never rational. And it's like, it's about things that literally don't matter. And if you sit down and think about it, you're like, oh, that doesn't matter. Why am I having this feeling? And even though rationally I can talk to myself and be like, Renee, why are you having these feelings right now? It doesn't matter. It's like is stuck in your head and you will experience it.
Renee has a PhD in psychology and is also the host of the Mom Room podcast and a TikToker extraordinaire. You can find Renee at themomroompodcast.com and on Instagram and TikTok at themomroompodcast. So if mom guilt is illogical, or at least if it can be, how do we know if it's the instructive adaptive guilt or just something to dismiss? Casey Reed, a mom of 2, owner of a real estate company, and one of my favorite humans, likes to get a second opinion, usually from her husband Jake, another great human.
I have lots of guilt, lots and lots. And I just have to talk it out and give myself permission to feel guilt and then give myself permission to let it go. And then I talk to Jake and, okay, I'm feeling this. Is this legitimate? And Jake can say, yes, that's actually a legitimate feeling. He usually doesn't say that, though, because usually my feelings are not legitimate. Usually they're out of I have some idea in my mind that is completely false, maybe spurred on by, maybe I read the post on Facebook recently that then got me thinking that maybe I was doing something wrong. So when I start doing that, sometimes I'll get off Facebook or I just won't read posts. I'll just post my own pictures when I find that posts are starting to make me feel guilty or I start to question my abilities. But I feel guilt a lot. I just have to talk it out with somebody. Or I'm an extrovert, so maybe as an introvert, you could process it in your head or maybe you can write it in your journal. And, seeing the words or hearing the words out loud, a lot of the times for me will make me realize how inaccurate they are.
Whether it's your spouse or other moms, if you feel guilt taking over so much that you've lost perspective, you can ask for help. It's really useful to get a pulse of what other moms are feeling for perspective and solidarity. So, since I have access to this large community of moms, I asked our Instagram community what kind of things they feel guilty about. I've divided their answers into 2 categories: omission, guilt for not doing something, and commission, guilt for doing something. Any guesses as to which was more prevalent? Out of 103 responses, 84% said they struggled with mom guilt, and 72% said they feel more omission guilt, and 28% feel that commission guilt, feeling guilt for what they should not have done. This tracks with what Bryce Reddy, a licensed counselor who specializes in maternal health, has found in her patients. She's had a lot of experience helping moms deal with guilt.
I think it's more of an omission thing, now that you say that, people feeling like, oh, I should have, fed my baby this certain way so they wouldn't be a picky eater, that kind of hindsight thing. Or I should have played more, or I wish I did more fun things with my kids, but I'm just so burnt out. And, that there's this kind of wishing that we kind of did the things that we think we're supposed to be doing, that quote unquote supposed to, right? And I don't want to say overcomplicating it, but kind of assigning ourselves these jobs in retrospect that we didn't follow through on and feeling guilty about that. And I think that's probably what I hear about the most, both in kind of the work I do with parents in person and both, what I hear and see in terms of, my Instagram community and the online work I do.
Speaking of her online work, you should all pause this right now and subscribe to Bryce's Instagram account at mombrain.therapist. This is where I first found her because she makes the most relatable graphics about motherhood. I feel like she can peer into my very soul every time she releases a new one. It's not very surprising, really, that we feel so guilty about things we think we are not doing, because there's an infinite amount of things that can fit in this category. Since we can't prioritize everything at once, there's always things we're not doing well or at all. And this is where guilt can become illogical really fast. Because, well, we don't have the infinite time it would require to do all the infinite things. And we also have this image of our heads of what a mom should be, whether from our own expectations, societal pressures, or just from looking at other mothers, including our own. We can't be just like any of those other mothers, and let's remember, that's a really good thing. When I asked about guilt triggers on Instagram, some of the responses in this category of omission were not knowing what to do or how to help, not reading all school communication or following up on homework, not doing enough or doing too much, not getting everything done, not being patient enough, not spending enough quality time with each kid, and not being the mom we think we'll be. That last one is a biggie. A lot of these shoulds stem from our expectations of ourselves or expectations from other people, both real and perceived. I did a whole episode, number 30, called A Mom's Job, all about this topic of expectations and how we all get to write our own job description. We even often feel guilt when we're doing something good or just fine because we're not doing something better. Let's call this opportunity cost guilt. Renee Rena talked about this in our conversation.
If it's like Saturday afternoon and we're watching a movie or something, I cannot just sit there and enjoy like cuddling with Milo and watching a movie. Because I'm like, you should be outside, you should be doing something, like get up and bake muffins with him, like do something. Even though rationally I'm like, Renee, can you just sit here and enjoy this moment? Like, it's okay to watch a movie every once in a while, Whereas like if it was a rainy, cold day, I wouldn't feel as bad, but God forbid it's sunny outside, then all of a sudden I feel bad for laying there and watching a movie. But before I even had kids, if I decided, oh, okay, I'm tired, I'm going to lay down, watch a movie, I wouldn't think twice about it. But there's something about having a kid, especially Milo's age, because he's younger, and being like, why do you can't just relax and watch a movie?
You're a mom now.
Yeah, I know. It makes no sense. So, and then there's my husband, having zero feelings about it, just enjoying himself.
Right. You can tell you're feeling the omission category of guilt when you use the word should. I should be doing this or I should be doing that. By contrast, the commission category of guilt is when we say, I shouldn't have done this or that. Things like losing our temper or, say, accidentally leaving a kid at church. Not that I know anything about that. Some things the How She Moms community put into this category are decisions that impact kids negatively, taking time for myself, losing control of my emotions, trying to control everything, working out, speaking harshly or yelling, leaving kids when I work. Isn't that so interesting that we can even feel guilt for just taking time to do regular things for ourselves? There's also another category of guilt that can be either commission or omission, and that is guilt for the past or regret. Here's Monica Packer.
We have a lot of women who work with me who have kids who have left the nest or may have left the nest a long time ago. And they're still on some levels struggling with mothering still,
Yeah.
and the shoulds that are there for sure.
Well, and maybe the shoulds have turned into what ifs at that point.
Oh yeah. And it's funny you say that because that's an episode I'm working on, is one about regret. because regret is a really painful feeling.
Yeah.
And I think as we get older, we have more regret because we've lived more years and we have more ways of knowing that we could have done that differently. And I think that's definitely part of the conversation, right? That we're having
Yeah.
as part of that mom guilt is regret and how
Yeah.
that can kind of take over.
We'll talk more about why mom guilt happens in the next section, but I think this is a good time to examine another question that keeps coming up. If mom guilt is a thing, what about dad guilt?
Yeah, and I've
Well-
never heard of dad guilt either. And that's
Right.
not to knock down on the men, because I'm so glad that I have a really awesome involved husband who's the father of our kids. But there is a different standard for us
Yeah.
women socially, but also within our own minds. And I think a lot of that has to do with just how we wrap up our motherhood into our own identity,
Yeah.
how we view ourselves. It really is so deep. And I'm sure men do this too, but there's some other like hidden level, both socially and internally, that I think we do as women about my performance as a mom, meaning my kids' performance truly is indicative of who I am as
Yeah.
a person and how good I am as that person. Was reading an article yesterday, and I don't know if you've seen like that cartoon that was kind of going around the past week of a side by side of a mom and a dad doing the same thing. Say the first slide is both a mom and dad wearing like joggers and like a relaxed shirt and holding up a bag that says fast food. And on the dad's side, it says fun dad. And on the mom's side, it says lazy mom. You know, and so you're right. There is a lot of social constructs going on. But I read the article with the cartoonist who did it, and they asked her about what she was hearing feedback wise from it. And she said the ones that she did not expect were from like hundreds of women who were writing her to say, what you shared is so true, but that voice is actually the voice in my head. It's not other
Oh.
people saying you're a lazy mom, you're a bad mom, you're uninvolved, you're just a normal mom. It's my own voice. So it just shows how it's a social thing, but it's so embedded in the way we think, the way we act, the way we evaluate. It's hard to get out of. It's kind of in the very air we're breathing.
Craig Nippenberg, a child and family therapist, provided a dad's perspective of this. Craig is also the host of a podcast called Legit Parenting.
It's easier as a father because as a man, if you see a dad with his preschooler at the coffee shop, Duffy Rolls is by my house. My buddy owns it. It's a great cinnamon roll shop. And there's a dad on Saturday with his little daughter, 3-year-old. He's holding them and they're talking to them and he's having his coffee. And what does everybody think? What a super dad, right? That's all you have to do. Now, that might be the only thing he does with that child for the whole week. But he's labeled a super dad because he looks nurturing, right? So for men, you throw a little nurturance out there, play with the kids a little bit, and everybody likes, oh, you're such a great dad. Well, that door doesn't swing both ways for moms.
Yeah.
For moms, it's a much harsher world. The bar is so much higher for moms. People will randomly go up to moms and say, oh, we should do this, or you shouldn't be doing that, or something. And you just want to slug them. It's so much for women. Historically, I think women judge themselves more based on their mothering and then feel guilt or shame that it wasn't good enough or up to the standards, or may then judge other moms about their parenting. Where I hear many men judging each other about the parenting.
However, let's be wary of getting into a guilt arms race. Maybe moms feel more guilt than dads generally, but dads are also people, so they too feel guilt when they make parenting mistakes. It would take a whole bunch of new interviews to investigate this question of the extent to which dads feel guilt, but a quick internet search turned up several articles, mostly about dads who feel guilt for not being present enough with their kids. Now that we've talked about what guilt is, let's talk about why we feel mom guilt. We're going to talk about 8 reasons, actually. But let's get this out in the open first. Guilt is a normal feeling to have as a mom, and most moms feel it to some degree. Don't go feeling guilty for having mom guilt. In fact, feeling mom guilt is probably a sign that you're a really good mom because it means you're trying really hard. Here's Bryce Reddy.
I think of mom guilt is just this kind of feeling we have that we're either like doing something wrong, we're messing up our kids, or we're falling short in some way. And I think it's pretty closely related to, just regular old guilt, but it just feels so much more strongly in motherhood, I think, because we take this job so seriously. We don't want to mess it up. And when we feel really strongly about something or really passionate about something, that's when that guilt can kind of come in and take grip, right? Because we take this job seriously, we want to do a good job, and we start micromanaging or analyzing every little thing, every little choice that we're making, and putting a lot of weight on that in terms of like what it might mean, what its outcome is.
It's a big responsibility to be in charge of another human being, sometimes when you've barely figured out how to take care of yourself. It starts right with pregnancy. So many new rules that you have to follow to protect this baby. I loved hearing this perspective from Annalisa Jones, a gynecologist and obstetrician, because it shows that it can happen to even someone who knows a lot about how to take care of both moms and babies.
There's so much guilt. I remember people would say, "Oh, she's so tiny," and I would want to like punch them in the face because I felt this like guilt that somehow my body made her this way, like that I didn't do something, or I was working too much, or I was not eating enough, and so she ended up small or whatever. I don't know if that's really true or not. I look back and probably it was, but I just felt such guilt and then such like anxiety over making sure she got enough to eat, and is she growing? And she was also a really difficult baby. She didn't sleep much. She wanted to nurse constantly, and I was in residency, and so I was pumping. I mean, it was just nuts. Those were nutty days.
There's so many rules, and you feel like if you make one mistake, you're hurting your baby. You can hear an entire episode featuring Annalisa on episode 85, How Annalisa Heals Herself and Other Moms After Childbirth. A second reason we feel mom guilt is because it's also new, and not just when you first become a mom. With every new stage and every new kid, you have new things to learn. Of course we're going to make a lot of mistakes. This is why 3 or 4 times a year I release episodes to update you on the latest experiments I'm trying in my own home. I share both the failures and the successes so we can all learn from both. Another reason we feel mom guilt is that insidious thief of joy, perfectionism. As author and philosopher Michael Novak said, the raising of children brings each of us breathtaking vistas of our inadequacy. Oh, and when kids realize you're not perfect, they're very willing to point it out to you. During a recent argument, one of my kids even said to me, "Why don't you start being a good mom instead of just podcasting about it?" Ouch. But I would suggest that I'm a much better podcaster and a much better mom because I'm not a perfect mom. No one wants a perfect mom because that would apply a lot of pressure to be perfect too. I love Bryce Reddy's perspective on this.
Our kids are always going to have complaints about how we raise them. There's no matter how wonderful we think we are, how wonderful our parents were, we can all pinpoint things that like could have been done differently or whatever, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we're not robots. We're imperfect people raising imperfect people, and that there's going to constantly be kind of mistakes and errors and, things we could have done differently or better with hindsight, a little bit of perspective, like in terms of like raising multiple children, right? That you kind of gain some perspective as you go along. And there's just something to, be said about that there is always going to be some imperfections in how we raise our kids. And 50 years from now, there's probably going to be a whole bunch of new parenting philosophies that differ from what we're being told today.
Instead of trying to be the mythological perfect mom or even worrying about whether you're a good mom, Brene Brown says, the real questions for parents should be, are you engaged? Are you paying attention? If so, plan to make lots of mistakes and bad decisions. Imperfect parenting moments turn into gifts as our children watch us try to figure out what went wrong and how we can do better next time. The mandate is not to be perfect and raise happy children. Perfection doesn't exist, and I've found what makes children happy doesn't always prepare them to be courageous, engaged adults. In a cruel trick of fate, becoming a mother and all that new stuff we have to learn also coincides with hormonal craziness, sleep deprivation, and frequently also postpartum anxiety and/or depression. So come on in, guilt. The door is wide open for you, and we've prepared the guest bedroom. Here's Dr. Annalisa Jones again.
I felt guilty, and then I felt anxious that I was trying to fix it, but I didn't know how. And then I felt more guilty because I was then having a depression component to it. Felt guilty that I I wasn't enjoying this baby. I have a newborn and it's so supposed to be sweet and bonding and everything should be lovely and she's beautiful. But I felt guilty because I wasn't enjoying her. And I felt resentment towards my newborn, who it's not her fault, and I didn't, and I didn't want to go hold her when she was crying. I just wanted to leave her because she was on me all the time and all of those things. So it's all together. Oh, totally wrapped up in all of that. Definitely early years. And I think that postpartum or the anxiety and depression can definitely it just snowballs. And so then you're constantly trying to manage that.
You're not at your best, but you feel like you're supposed to be because this baby depends on you. Bryce Reddy also had such great things to say about this.
Yeah, well, I think there's like, they call postpartum depression like kind of the smiling depression, because we're told as, mothers that this is supposed to be a great time in our lives. It's supposed to be such a happy time. And it isn't necessarily for a lot of people for a variety of reasons. I had postpartum depression and I'm a therapist, and I didn't realize I had postpartum depression. I was having all these intrusive thoughts and I was like only eating peanut butter crackers. In retrospect, I look back and I'm like, oh my God, Bryce, like you were really depressed and you didn't even realize it. But there was an expectation on me to, from a variety of, societal ways. And my son was also in the NICU but he was like a big healthy baby in the NICU for being a preemie, and everyone was like, you should be so grateful. Look at all these other little babies. And, that there is kind of this feeling that we have to kind of keep denying how we're really feeling. So we kind of play this role of like, I'm really happy, like I'm smiling, even though kind of there's these other clues that are going on. I think that being mindful and being willing to kind of look at ourselves in those moments and have our families be aware of the signs and symptoms of postpartum depression prior to us having children and having these conversations prior to childbirth, so that it's not just us being on the lookout for these signs and symptoms, that we have a support system that's able to kind of look at us, including our doctors, letting them know of any history of anxiety or depression in our past. Yeah. And just having these conversations, having to be out in the open.
Another interesting thing I started to notice as I talked to more and more moms about mom guilt is that maybe we're confusing other feelings with guilt, or at least mixing them together. For example, if you have to go back to work and leave your baby at home or at daycare, you may feel guilty, but you also may just miss your baby. Those are really two different emotions that we sometimes pin on guilt. Then there are other emotions like anxiety or even loneliness. I asked Bryce Reddy what she thought about this theory.
I once read this article and it was talking about, going back to work, and that it was like a bouquet of emotions that they were carrying with them. Confusion and exhaustion and fatigue and anger that they had to go back, but also kind of wanting to go back. And, that there's this whole bouquet of carrying all of these things around. And guilt is kind of like, I don't want to say an easy one to kind of take on, because it's kind of like this cultural thing, mom guilt, right, that we hear about all the time. And sometimes that's easier than kind of sitting and dealing with that whole bouquet of emotions that might be coming up. And some of that might be relief. I don't know about anybody else, but when I had like postpartum depression, I felt relief to go back to work. I also felt guilty because I felt relief, because I wanted that like to feel connected to myself and connected to kind of something I was really good at, because I was not very good at being a new mom at that moment, right? Or at least I was still learning, and that felt weird. So being able to kind of identify all of those emotions that are coming up and not shy away from them is an important piece too.
Both Bryce and Annalisa already touched on this a bit, but the fifth reason guilt sneaks in is that we have so many expectations for ourselves and about what motherhood will be like, and those expectations aren't always or even usually true.
People wax philosophically about, what a wonderful time this is, and it's the best time of your life, and all these platitudes that we're kind of given both as pregnant people and, in their newborn phase, and when you're not feeling that, it's rough. I remember walking down the road with my first baby who I had postpartum depression with. I didn't have postpartum with my other children, but my son cried 24 hours a day. He was a preemie. He was just mad that he was outside in the real world. And I remember walking down the road, like I would walk with him every day because I just couldn't sit in my house with him screaming 24/7. And this couple stopped me and they were like, oh, this is the best time, isn't it? I was like, yes, it's wonderful. I don't know. And I just kind of like a zombie, like walked away, because I was just like, wow, is this really what it's going to be like? How long is this going to be like this? And, you start kind of going down this path of, just what am I missing? What's wrong with me? Something must be wrong with me if this is what everyone else is experiencing.
I definitely felt this kind of guilt when the days were hard with a newborn, especially because we had tried for so long before we finally had our first baby through in vitro. I'd imagined having a baby for so long, I thought I would love everything about it. I did really love the newborn stage, overall, but I also didn't love it sometimes. I specifically picture a time when I realized that my first son was going to cry whether I held him or not, and I was starting to lose my cool. So I put him safely in his crib, still screaming, and I very aggressively jumped on my bed to get my frustration out. It's easy to feel guilty and ungrateful in moments like that. The sixth reason for mom guilt is information overload. We live in an unprecedented age for information and for being able to see how other moms do things. Here's a voice from a mom who raised her kids pre-internet to put that into perspective. Janet Thompson talking about moms in the age of social media.
Oh my gosh, I just feel for them. There's so many things that you can do nowadays. You do all these cute crafts, you can make these super parties, you can do all that stuff. I don't know. I just didn't feel as much of that, but I did feel it. I did feel it.
You can hear more of my conversation with Janet in episode 76, How Janet Gathers Family and Friends. Here's Bryce Reddy talking about this information overload.
There is so much in terms of parenting education out there right now, and this kind of constant information about how every single thing we do is impacting our kids in a lot of ways. I think that we're seeing it a little bit more, or I'm at least hearing about it a little bit more from parents. I think years ago, parents just they raised their kids and that was it, they weren't really trying to look 50 years or 40 years down the line and thinking how is every action we make impacting this little human that we're responsible for. And maybe that they should have been, or I don't know, but today we scroll social media and we're constantly seeing all of this kind of reparenting information, and we're seeing all of this information about how to parent in the best ways. And I think that we're kind of internalizing a lot of that and thinking that every little action that we do is having this long-term impact, and that can bring a lot of anxiety, I think, onto us, and exacerbate some of the guilt that we might naturally feel on its own.
And often the messages we see are completely opposite. Some people tell us we need to be more firm with more discipline. Others say we should be gentle and soft. We can take this conflicting information and let it overwhelm us or turn us into unrequited perfectionists, or we can embrace the variety, the endless possibilities, and recognize that since it's impossible to do all the things, we get to pick. The seventh reason is that we've become very focused on children. My friend Whitney Thomas and I both read and loved a book called All Joy and No Fun by Jennifer Senior. It's all about the impact modern parenting has on the parents, and it's a fascinating read. Jennifer Senior says, "Not all that long ago, mothers and fathers had children because it was customary, or because it was economically necessary, or because it was a moral obligation to family and community, or often for all three reasons. Today, however, adults often view children as one of life's crowning achievements, and they approach child-rearing with the same bold sense of independence and individuality that they would any other ambitious life project, spacing children apart according to their own needs and raising them according to their individual child-rearing philosophies." The book wasn't really about whether this was good or bad. It was just analyzing the impact that that's had on society and on parents specifically. Whitney and I had such an interesting discussion about the way this change has affected our perspective and mom guilt. Here's Whitney.
I believe that it is helpful and my duty as a mom for my kids to realize that they are not the center of the world. And so when we are children focused, I think it becomes very easy for them to believe that they are the center of the world. And so I think it's a lot easier to replace that guilt of, oh, I'm doing this and oh, I should be with my kids, to being like, no, my kids, I am their mom and I need to teach them that people aren't just there to take care of their every single desire all of the time. They need to learn this. And by me removing myself from the situation to allow myself, time for self-care, that is important. So it's a kind of like doing, I mean, it teaches so many things. One, it teaches them that they're going to need to take care of themselves to be able to take care of their responsibilities in life. It teaches them that they are not the center of the universe. You know, there's just a lot of things that I feel like are important for them, you know, to learn. I think sometimes as moms, that's one of the things that trips us up the most is we are too zoomed in. And so we're like reacting to like, oh, you're right. Like, this is so, oh, I'm selfish. Instead of like the zoom out of the big picture of like what I'm supposed to be teaching as a mother, what I, you know, like, or not supposed to, but like what I want to be teaching my kids and who I want them to become and what I want them to see in the big picture. And I think a lot of times with our guilt, that's something really helpful is to zoom out and look at the big picture instead of the immediacy of like what you're feeling guilty about, you know.
And I saved the one that has had the most impact on me personally for last. One of the reasons we feel guilt is that we think we have a greater impact than we actually do. We take more credit and more responsibility than we should. For example, it's just become commonplace to joke that our kids are going to land in therapy because of us. We think we have the power to ruin our children or to make them succeed. We forget that they're actual people with their own choices. The best podcast episode I've heard on this topic is by the lovely Cheryl Cardall, host of the podcast Fight Like a Mother. She was a guest on my show right as her podcast was launching, and oh boy, she's covered some ground on that podcast. It's geared toward parents of children with mental health challenges, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, and other neurodiversity. It's such a great resource, and she's such a compassionate host. You'll definitely want to listen to the whole episode, number 54, How to Deal with Others' Judgments. I'm first going to play a clip from the beginning, a collection of common phrases we hear of
Your son got into his 3 dream universities with a full-ride scholarship? Well, of course he did. Look at who his parents are. Oh man, your kids are so obedient and listen to you so well. What amazing parents you are. Whoa. So your son is raising funds to send to orphans in Africa? What a kid. He really learned from the best. You guys are amazing. Wow. That kid didn't even graduate from high school. Well, of course he didn't. Look at who his parents are. Did you hear that Cheryl gets calls weekly from the assistant principal and her kids got suspended? Wow, they really need to be more strict and up their parenting game. What? Your kids has major meltdowns and puts holes in walls and breaks things? Whoa. You really need to give him harsher punishments to stop him from doing that. Why would you let your kid talk to you like that? Did you hear how her kid talked to her? I would never allow my kid to say those words to me.
I'm sure you've heard people say things like this too, both on the positive and negative side, or that you've even said them yourselves. I know I have. Now let's hear Cheryl's beautiful response to this kind of thinking.
Oh man, guys, the judgments levied at us as parents, sometimes they feel really good when your kids are succeeding and doing well, because those are judgments too. But if you are raising a complex kid with extra challenges who's struggling, you often get negative judgments and tons of parenting advice thrown your way. Believe me, I know. Can we see that both sides of these judgments are harmful? The praising of parents for their kids' accomplishments is really just as harmful as criticizing us for their challenges. What if the kid who had a full-ride scholarship to those dream colleges goes to college, gets overwhelmed, really starts to struggle, and flunks out? What are you going to say then? Is that the parent's fault? Or what if that perfect student of the month suddenly develops crippling anxiety due to that perfectionism and the expectations put upon her, and she can't get out of bed in the morning to go to school? Is that the parent's fault? Basing our parenting successes and failures on our kids' accomplishments and behaviors is detrimental to everyone. It feels good to get that payday of, oh, they're the student of the month, or they got the scholarship, or they chose to go on a mission trip. But what happens when they don't?
Cheryl goes on to say that we do still have influence on our children and can teach them a lot of things. So this whole parenting thing still does make a difference. But I want to leave you with that thought that we ultimately don't control our children and their behavior, and therefore we cannot heap guilt or shame upon ourselves for the choices they make or the behavior they choose. You are doing your best. You're listening to a parenting podcast, for heaven's sake. You are a great mom, and there's no shame in that. Thank you so much for listening to the How She Moms podcast and for being part of this community. There are so many other ways for you to connect and hopefully also contribute. I share tips and ideas regularly on Instagram and Facebook at How She Moms. You can find past episodes and other resources at howshemoms.com. And you can always just email me directly at whitney@howshemoms.com. Special thanks to my own wonderful mom, Susan Singley, for recording my theme music. She played this song all the time when I was growing up, and to me, it's the soundtrack of motherhood.